In the days after King Robert Baratheon's untimely death, chaos gripped the Seven Kingdoms like a tightening noose. Rumors rippled through castle halls, bazaars, and taverns, speaking of children fathered by incest, a hand of the king imprisoned, and lords across the realms scrambling for alliances. In King's Landing, the Lannisters moved swiftly. Lord Tywin Lannister, ensconced in the fortress of Harrenhal with the bulk of the Lannister forces, watched the chaos with calculating eyes. Meanwhile, Queen Cersei in the Red Keep tried to fortify her son Joffrey's claim, though her methods often lacked the fine subtlety that was her father's hallmark. While the capital simmered under the new reign of a boy king, the southern lords of the Reach eyed the unfolding political landscape with caution. Highgarden had every reason to resent King's Landing after the events of Robert's rebellion. Yet there was a figure among them, sharp of tongue, sharper of mind, who saw in all this upheaval an opportunity. Lady Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, was no stranger to the labyrinthine games of power. Her son Mace Tyrell, besotted with dreams of Tyrell glory, largely spent his time hosting feasts, extolling the virtues of his house, and basking in the splendor of Highgarden's gardens. Olenna, by contrast, had no patience for wasted chatter. As Renly Baratheon whispered in Marjorie's ear about queenship and love, Olenna studied the man. Renly had a charm about him, a kindness that might make small folk cheer, but that alone hardly won wars. When Renly proposed to marry Marjorie Tyrell, bringing the strength of the Reach behind his own claim, Olenna listened but did not commit her entire heart. At the same time, ravens flew from Tywin Lannister's camp. One such raven reached Highgarden before Renly had even begun to set his plans in stone. Tywin's message was deft in its language, polite, acknowledging the Tyrell's might and offering potential betrothals. Olenna saw a glint of advantage there. Tywin was not a man who wasted words or courtesies. If he had gone to the trouble of praising the Tyrell name, he wanted something. Perhaps he wanted Marjorie for Joffrey. Perhaps he wanted a stable alliance in the south to squeeze out any would-be challengers. In Olenna's eyes, Tywin was a man who usually got what he desired. Where Renly spoke of chivalry and open-handed generosity, Tywin's approach was pragmatic. Olenna weighed each side. Renly's charm did not deceive her into forgetting that his claim to the throne, while compelling to some lords, was not strictly by blood. He had no direct lineal right as strong as Stannis, nor the cunning to outlast Tywin in a prolonged war. Besides, if Renly fell, House Tyrell would pay dearly. So she sent word back to Lord Tywin, suggesting she could bring Highgarden and the Reach into an alliance with House Lannister on the condition that the Tyrell name would be elevated to new heights of power. The letter was short, sweet, and full of barbed pleasantries, very much Olenna's style. Even as Mace Tyrell flounced about proclaiming that Renly would make a splendid king, Olenna arranged private talks with Tywin's envoys. Those envoys quickly promised something both Mace and Olenna found compelling: Marjorie Tyrell, queen to Joffrey Baratheon. Olenna was under no illusions about Joffrey's nature. Rumors drifted of the boy's cruelty, yet she knew how precarious the times were. She calculated that, if they moved decisively, they could take advantage of the confusion in the Stormlands, where Renly and Stannis were poised to clash. House Tyrell controlled massive armies and bountiful harvests, making them indispensable in any war. Tywin Lannister had gold, cunning, and a fearsome name that cowed half the realm. Such a combination could crush any resistance early, particularly if done before all the realm's other wolves scented blood. Her decision made, Olenna turned her back on the bright, glittering illusions of a Renly Baratheon kingship and, instead, offered a sealed pact to Tywin Lannister. So it was that the first hammer blow of the War of the Five Kings was dealt not in the north or at King's Landing, but in the Stormlands near the border with the Reach. As Renly paraded his host through the fertile fields, expecting to gather the support of Tarleys, Rowans, and other Reach bannermen, the Tyrell armies he counted upon did not appear. Instead, they marched under the Lion and Rose banners, the Gold Lion of House Lannister, the Golden Rose of House Tyrell. Rumor had it that Renly, upon hearing that the main Tyrell force had not joined him, let slip a laugh of disbelief. Then the laugh faded. His scouts brought tales of a huge army on the move, not to join him but to corner him. His dream of marching on King's Landing with 100,000 men, flowered banners streaming behind him, wavered. At Bitter Bridge, confusion reigned. Renly's supporters discovered that some local lords, once sworn to Highgarden, were hesitating. The rowdy carnival atmosphere that had accompanied Renly's traveling court began to sour. Men left the feasting tents, put away their bright tents and finery, and strapped on steel. Yet it was too late. Lord Tyrell had turned his might to the new cause. The Tyrell bannermen, led by Randyll Tarly among others, advanced in well-ordered columns, joined by detachments of Lannister men from the west. Renly's forces numbered many knights from the Reach who had been loyal out of love for Marjorie or for the promise of fighting under the charismatic Renly. But they could not match the combined weight of Tyrell and Lannister steel. Renly discovered that his younger brother's claim to Storm's End had been overshadowed. Stannis Baratheon, though older, had mustered fewer men, but he was dogged and determined. In a normal scenario, Renly would have easily overshadowed Stannis with the Tyrell alliance, but that rug had been pulled away from him. Now, both Baratheon brothers found themselves outmaneuvered. The new alliance needed only a swift strike to break them both, provided they timed it right. Weeks later, in the fields near Summerhall, the Tyrell Lannister host confronted Renly's grand but disheartened army. Mounted on a splendid chestnut courser, the young Baratheon king in all but name still cut a striking figure in his green-tinged armor. The banners of the Baratheon stag whipped in the wind behind him. Marjorie Tyrell was nowhere in sight, nor was Loras Tyrell. Before the lines met, an envoy from Tywin offered Renly terms. Lay down his arms, concede Joffrey's throne, and accept a lordship. Renly refused, still trusting in the loyalty of those who had come so far with him. The ensuing battle was short and decisive. The Tyrell cavalry, led by Randyll Tarly, tore into Renly's flanks, while the Lannister center pinned Renly in place. Once the king's guard for Renly saw the lines collapsing, they tried to spirit him away, but Renly insisted on fighting. In the end, he was pulled from his horse, a spear lodged through the joints in his armor. Some said Renly died with surprise in his eyes, as if he could not believe his luck had truly run out. So ended the claim of Renly Baratheon before it had truly flowered, undone by the sudden shift of Highgarden. While rumors spread that Loras Tyrell was inconsolable at Renly's death, House Tyrell was not about to let one night's heartbreak overshadow their entire strategy. Olenna Tyrell moved quickly to quell any sympathy for Renly among her extended family. She insisted that the Tyrells had only chosen the stronger side, that Joffrey was king by right, and that, in such times, a house must do what was best for itself and for the realm. Some objected, yet gold and promises from Casterly Rock smoothed the concerns of many. Besides, with House Tyrell now aligned firmly to the Lannisters, the question was, what next? The next step, of course, was Stannis. The elder Baratheon brother had set his sights on King's Landing. He had fewer men than Renly had boasted, but his army was tempered by discipline. His new Red Priestess, Melisandre, stoked fears among the faint of heart. Still, Tywin Lannister was no fool. With the Tyrell armies at his back, and with the fatherly authority he held over his children in the capital, he wasted no time in summoning the remnants of the crown's forces. The plan was to use the sea superiority of the Redwyne fleet, long allied with the Tyrells, to block any attempt by Stannis to send ships up the Blackwater. Meanwhile, a joint Lannister-Tyrell army would sweep through the Stormlands and reduce Stannis's holdings there. House Baratheon of Dragonstone found itself caught in a vice. The Redwyne fleet, bolstered by Lannister gold, arrived off the coast of the Stormlands sooner than expected. The inhabitants of the Stormlands, many of whom were loyal to Renly's memory, felt bitterness at the new alliance, yet recognized that the Tyrells had the largest armies in the south. Stannis himself pressed on with his designs for a strike at King's Landing, reasoning that Joffrey was an abomination born of incest, and that it was his duty to remove the false king. But the combined fleet from the Arbor, joined by ships from Oldtown, had the advantage. Before Stannis could even attempt a crossing from Dragonstone to the mouth of the Blackwater, the Tyrell Lannister navy engaged him. The Battle of the Gullet was short and brutal, The sea burned with wildfire launched from Lannister ships, while the Redwynes and their allies boarded Stannis' smaller vessels with savage efficiency. Though Stannis led a fierce defense, his flagship was beset. Seeing the hopelessness of the situation, he retreated to Dragonstone, a battered fraction of his once proud fleet in tow. Meanwhile, Tywin marched from the Stormlands, quickly reducing Stannis' loyal keeps. Storm's End was battered into submission not by siege but by an overwhelming show of force. Dismayed that the defenders even considered holding out against the might of the newly minted alliance, Tywin threatened that if they did not surrender, every man inside would lose not just their lands but their bloodline's legacy. After the example made of a few rebellious knights, Storm's End opened its gates, though it did so in sullen silence. Stannis' men withdrew to Dragonstone or scattered into the countryside. Some might have thought to regroup and attempt a guerrilla war, but with the largest Tyrell armies fanning out and enforcing order, it became impossible for pockets of resistance to hold. Thus, the War of the Five Kings in the south ended almost as quickly as it began. With Renly dead and Stannis penned onto his island fortress, the Baratheon cause was all but destroyed. Joffrey Baratheon, recognized by Tywin's allies as the rightful king, sat the Iron Throne, and House Tyrell, far from being left out in the cold, now enjoyed a position of unprecedented influence in King's Landing. Before, they had chafed under the overshadowing presence of House Lannister, but with Olenna Tyrell negotiating clever terms, the Tyrells won significant concessions. Margaery Tyrell would wed King Joffrey as soon as was seemly, forging the capital connection. Ser Loras Tyrell, rumored to be grieving in private, was named to the Kingsguard, an honor that came with prestige. Mace Tyrell was granted new honors, including a promise that if the royal line failed, House Tyrell might stand next in line. These were carefully worded in the letters patent so as not to alarm the crown or the other great houses, but Olenna's eyes glowed with the sense of how thoroughly she had outmaneuvered the field. King's Landing changed. The arrival of the Tyrell host meant the city was well provisioned. Instead of the hunger and desperation that had plagued the city in the original timeline, where the city suffered under siege and the farmers' fields were left fallow, there was now a relative bounty. Grain and fresh produce came up the Rose Road in heavily guarded wagons. The city's markets bustled. Small folk who had grown used to high prices found some relief and attributed it to the new queen-to-be, Margaery Tyrell. Margaery, taught by her grandmother, played the game of public favor skillfully. She took tours of the city's orphanages, distributed bread and sweets, and even visited the Blackwater Bay to greet fishermen returning to port. The people began to speak of her as the new Little Rose, a bright hope in contrast to the increasingly erratic King Joffrey. Joffrey, for his part, was both enchanted by Margaery's beauty and confused by her composure. She seemed far more poised than Sansa Stark had been. This new betrothed wife did not tremble in fear before Joffrey's temper, and when he snapped, she somehow soothed him or redirected the conversation skillfully. Cersei, at first suspicious, found herself ironically relieved that Margaery was not as meek as Sansa. Even so, tensions lurked. Cersei resented how quickly Margaery gained the favor of the small folk and the courtiers. The last thing Cersei wanted was another queen overshadowing her influence on her son. But Tywin had insisted. The Tyrell alliance was vital to maintaining order in the realm. Cersei could glower, but she had to accept it. As the newly united forces began to bring order to the south, Tywin's attention turned elsewhere. Word came that Robb Stark, the so-called king in the north, had won a victory at Riverrun, capturing Jaime Lannister. Under normal circumstances, Tywin might have turned all his armies northward in retaliation. However, now that the Baratheon threat was extinguished, the old lion could plan carefully. Instead of rushing to fight the Starks on their terrain, Tywin worked behind the scenes. He used the Tyrell network of trade and harvest to put the Riverlords under economic pressure. He arranged for a partial blockade of the coastline with the Redwyne fleet. The north, while vast, lacked certain resources. The Tullus had been battered by the initial stages of the war. If Tywin managed to create dissent among the northern bannermen, some of whom might balk at a prolonged conflict with the crown, and promise them safe passage for their harvests and livestock, he could peel away Robb's allies. At least that was the hope. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep, the delicate interplay of personalities persisted. Tyrion Lannister had returned to King's Landing at his father's summons, tasked with the management of the city and the tenuous alliances. The imp discovered that while the city was better fed, it still seethed with rumors and intrigue. Peter Baelish and Varys whispered in dark corridors. The Queen of Thorns, Lady Olenna, had taken up temporary residence in the Tower of the Hand, ironically pushing out many of the prior staff. She hosted her little gatherings of court ladies, dropping cutting remarks about everything from the small council's inefficiency to the last wedding feast's dryness of duck. Tyrion, always one to appreciate a sharp mind, found himself verbally sparring with her on more than one occasion. She rarely lost. The conversation behind these lavish curtains was always about what would happen next. Stannis still brooded on Dragonstone. Could he try something desperate? Some whispered that his Red Priestess might conjure shadow assassins or black magic. But Tywin was not a man to lose sleep over stories. He had already stationed men along the coast, with Redwine ships patrolling the waters. Even if Stannis tried to slip into Blackwater Bay, the Watchers would see him. As for the north, Tywin had begun to dispatch envoys to treat with Walder Frey. If the Freys and some other riverlords could be won or bribed away from House Tully, Robb Stark would find his supply lines threatened. Through all of this, Margaery Tyrell busied herself with wedding preparations. Cloaked under the excitement of her upcoming nuptials, she and Olenna made subtle inroads at court. They befriended many of the ladies-in-waiting who had once served Cersei or Sansa. They spread coin among the city watch so that rumors favorable to House Tyrell circulated. Ser Loras Tyrell, though newly appointed to the Kingsguard, undertook his duties with a stony professionalism. He seldom spoke of Renly, and when he did, his voice was clipped. Nonetheless, the small folk admired the Knight of Flowers. His feats in tournament memory still enchanted them, and they cheered him wherever he rode through the city. Finally, the day of the royal wedding arrived. Joffrey Baratheon wed Margaery Tyrell in the Great September of Baelor, in a ceremony as grand as any King's Landing had ever seen. Roses and golden lions were woven into the banners, and hundreds of candles lit the September septon after septon droned on with prayers, though Margaery offered them a radiant smile. Joffrey fidgeted and tried to project regal majesty, though he had never had the patience for such formalities. When they emerged to the crowds, the populace cheered wildly. Wine, bread, and sweet treats had been distributed beforehand, courtesy of the Tyrell coffers, so the mood was joyous. Even in Flea Bottom, a festival atmosphere reigned, with puppet shows reenacting the wedding in comedic form. Inside the Red Keep, a lavish feast ensued. Courses of venison, trout, and swan pies abounded. Musicians played day and night, acrobats performed, and jugglers danced through the hall. Yet amidst the revelry, the tension between Lannister and Tyrell was evident in subtle ways. Cersei had donned a forced smile throughout, raising her cup in toasts to her new daughter-in-law. Olenna Tyrell politely complimented the Queen Regent's dress, but her eyes flicked with mild amusement, as if she could see the discomfort in Cersei's posture. Tyrion drank more than his share, scanning the crowd for potential threats. Sansa Stark, still a hostage guest in King's Landing, tried to keep her composure, sitting with folded hands, overshadowed by Margaery's brilliance. Sansa noticed how Margaery's eyes never missed a chance to charm the crowd, how she skillfully guided Joffrey away from potential tantrums. Sansa felt relief that perhaps, just perhaps, Joffrey's cruelty might be tempered by Margaery's influence. At least that was the hope. The next morning, Tywin Lannister convened the small council. Mace Tyrell, recently named Master of Ships, though effectively overshadowed by the Redwine captains, had a seat. Tyrion Lannister sat as Master of Coin, though Peter Baelish was none too pleased to cede that position. Grand Maester Pycelle mumbled in agreement with whomever spoke the loudest. Varys watched like a spider at the edge of its web. The agenda: how to bring the North to heel without plunging the realm into deeper bloodshed. Tywin reasoned that the best route was to undermine Robb Stark's alliances. The Freys had leverage. If they abandoned the Starks, or turned on them at a critical juncture, Robb's entire campaign would crumble. Even the Tullus might be compelled to consider peace if the combined might of Lannister and Tyrell threatened them. The council debated strategies to ensure the North would be subdued quickly. Mace Tyrell boasted of how swiftly his knights could cross the riverlands, but Tywin insisted on a more methodical approach. A swift approach had worked in the Stormlands because the Tyrell armies were already near, and the region was not nearly as vast. The North was an entirely different matter. In quiet corners, Olenna Tyrell offered her own perspective. If they turned the might of Highgarden northward, the common folk might grumble that the Tyrells were becoming bullies across the realm. Better, she suggested, to maintain the perception of peace and bounty in the south. Let the Lannisters bear the brunt of the northern war. Meanwhile, the Tyrells could act as mediators, ensuring that the realm viewed them as the benevolent side of this new regime. Tywin found her arguments sensible. Indeed, they aligned with his desire to keep the Tyrells from overshadowing the Lannisters. Let Highgarden's forces remain mostly in the south, controlling the Stormlands, pacifying rebellious pockets, and ensuring shipments of food to King's Landing. Lannister forces, reinforced with select Tyrell bannermen, would deal with the Starks. Not everyone in King's Landing supported this plan. Tyrion himself wondered if negotiations with the Starks might be more prudent. Peace terms could be offered. Return of Jaime Lannister in exchange for Sansa and a southern withdrawal. Tywin listened with cool eyes. Were the Starks willing to give up their claim to northern independence and reaffirm fealty to the crown? If so, perhaps an arrangement could be struck. But any arrangement would require the release of Jaime. Tywin's desire to free his son was unyielding. In time, word arrived that Robb Stark had met and scattered a small Lannister force near the Golden Tooth. That same raven reported that the Kingslayer was still a captive, well guarded. Tywin's jaw tightened at the news. Now, more than ever, he wanted to bring Robb Stark to heel. But just as he was about to move a large portion of the southern host north, an unexpected disruption occurred in the east. The Ironborn, under Balon Greyjoy, declared independence, raiding the western coasts and setting their sights on the north. The plan to subdue the Starks was about to become more complicated, though ironically, the Ironborn threat might also serve the crown's interests. If the Ironborn hammered the north, the Starks would be forced to fight a war on two fronts. Perhaps that would fracture their strength more quickly than any direct confrontation with Lannisters. Tywin sent ravens to Highgarden, letting the Tyrells know that he would dispatch some forces north, but also urging them to remain vigilant. If the Ironborn grew too bold, they might raid the coastline of the Reach. The Redwynes might hold them at sea, but there were always places to land if one was cunning enough. Olenna responded with a letter that brimmed with wry humor, promising that any Ironborn who came near Highgarden would find the Mander choked with their corpses. Still, she and Mace Tyrell took the threat seriously, fortifying the coastal watchtowers and sending some men to support Old Town. Thus the shape of the realm took form. The crown, under House Lannister and Tyrell's alliance, held King's Landing and the south. Stannis Baratheon stood cornered on Dragonstone, with only a minimal chance to sally forth unless he dared risk the Redwyne Lannister fleet again. The north, under Robb Stark, fought to maintain its independence, now harried by Ironborn marauders. The Vale remained aloof, with Lysa Arryn reluctant to commit. Dorne watched warily, remembering old enmities with the Reach. But with the Queen of Thorns carefully sending polite missives to Dorne's ruling Prince Doran, there were hints of a possible rapprochement, if the Lannisters and Tyrells were willing to offer certain concessions for the murder of Elia Martell years ago. In the capital, Margaery's star rose. She proved adept at handling King Joffrey. While he was prone to cruelty, it was never quite so public under Margaery's watchful eye. She arranged hunts, dances, and feasts that both delighted the young king and distracted him from tormenting the court. Sansa Stark found herself strangely grateful for Margaery's presence. Though Sansa's own situation was still precarious, Joffrey's attention was less on tormenting her and more on winning Margaery's approval. Cersei, however, was not pleased. She sensed she was losing influence over her son. One day, she confronted Margaery in private, insinuating that the new queen had grown too bold. Marjorie only smiled demurely and insisted that everything she did was for the good of the king and the realm. Cersei could hardly rebuke that without appearing petty. In the small council chambers, Tyrion found it both exasperating and refreshing to deal with Olenna Tyrell. She would sweep in, ignoring many courtesies, and fix him with her sharp eyes. "My dear imp," she would say, "have you decided how we're going to pay for all these new warships your father is so fond of building?" Tyrion, stammering but intrigued, would show her the accounts. She would tut and scold as though Tyrion were a boy caught stealing from the larder. Yet, in the end, she would propose solutions. The Reach, after all, had coin to spare. Highgarden had not been ravaged by war. Investments in trade with Bravos, Myr, and Pentos could bring in more revenue for the crown, so long as the Tyrells got their fair share. Tyrion recognized these negotiations for what they were: the Tyrells consolidating their hold on the economy of Westeros. If they controlled both the food supply and trade routes, they would become as powerful as the Lannisters' gold mines, perhaps more so, in the eyes of the smallfolk. In the far north, winter winds howled. Robb Stark moved from one battlefield to the next, trying to fend off the Ironborn while also keeping an eye on any Lannister offensives. The Karstarks grew restless, especially after Jaime Lannister remained captive for so long with no sign of retribution for the deaths inflicted upon their ranks. The news from King's Landing was grim. Sansa was still a hostage, Ned Stark was long dead, and there seemed little hope of an immediate rescue. Even the Tullus worried that their cause might be lost if the crown decided to crush them in full. Yet weeks dragged on, and though the Lannister armies probed the borders of the Riverlands, they did not launch a major invasion. Perhaps Tywin believed that letting the Ironborn weaken the north was better than risking heavy losses. The Tyrell alliance made it even easier to bide time. They had the resources. They could wait for the north to starve or be picked apart by the Ironborn. Back in King's Landing, the power dynamic continued to shift. Queen Marjorie made herself beloved by the small folk. She opened new soup kitchens, funded repairs to the city walls, and even oversaw the distribution of new bread loaves that were stamped with a rose sigil. Cersei fumed in private. She recognized the Tyrell strategy, to portray themselves as the bringers of life and bounty, overshadowing the Lannisters' wealth, which was seldom seen by the public. The Lannisters had long used intimidation and fear to maintain power. The Tyrells sought popularity. Both were effective tools in ruling, and so a quiet rivalry blossomed between the two great houses, even as they stood side by side on the Iron Throne's dais. Tywin was not blind to these developments. He summoned Mace Tyrell and Olenna for private audiences more than once, reminding them that Joffrey was the king, and that House Tyrell owed him fealty. Olenna would smile sweetly, apologizing for any misunderstanding, but pointing out that the city's happiness only strengthened Joffrey's rule. It was difficult to argue against that logic. Besides, Tywin was focused on ensuring the crown faced no further rebellions. He wanted Stannis Baratheon dealt with in finality, but the cost of launching a naval assault on Dragonstone was high, especially with the Ironborn stirring trouble on the seas. The Redwynes could blockade Dragonstone indefinitely. Eventually Stannis would run out of supplies. Better to starve him out. But Stannis, ever the stubborn one, refused to bend the knee. Surrounded by advisors, the Red Priestess, and a small but zealous force, he waited for a moment of weakness in the crown's defenses. Months passed. The capital, for the first time in many years, found itself ironically stable under the watchful eyes of Tywin and Olenna. The Tyrell-Lannister union brought a measure of prosperity, at least for those who did not dwell too deep in the city's underbelly. Even Flea Bottom was less chaotic than usual, though it remained a pit of squalor. Joffrey's wedding year was celebrated with more tournaments. At one such tourney, Loras Tyrell unseated the Hound, drawing cheers. The Hound spat curses, but Loras only bowed politely to the stands where the king and queen watched. Joffrey delighted in the violence of the joust, yet Marjorie guided him to distribute the champion's purse to the city orphans. This little interplay captured the entire dynamic. Lannister ferocity and Tyrell magnanimity, locked in a balancing act. Sansa, for her part, moved carefully through this new landscape. She found Marjorie surprisingly kind, even protective in subtle ways, but Sansa had learned not to trust kindness at face value. The Tyrells wanted Sansa's goodwill, for it never hurt to keep the daughter of the late Ned Stark as a potential pawn. Still, that was far better than being at Joffrey's mercy. More than once, Marjorie spoke softly to her about how she understood Sansa's losses, how she hoped one day House Tyrell and House Stark could be friends. Sansa nodded politely, uncertain. She noticed the rumors swirling that perhaps Sansa might be wed off to a lesser Tyrell lord to keep her docile. Alternatively, some whispered that Tyrion Lannister might still be forced to marry her, to tie up the question of the North's inheritance. These rumors set Sansa's nerves on edge, but for the time being, no firm betrothal came. The realm was unsettled enough that no single arrangement seemed certain. Meanwhile, the Ironborn pressed deeper into the north, seizing Moat Cailin, burning White Harbor's ships, and proclaiming Balon Greyjoy as king of the Isles and the North. Robb Stark reeled from these attacks. He had some successes on land, but the Ironborn were elusive when it came to sea power. The young wolf faced a choice: continue his war against the crown, or fall back to defend the North. Increasingly, the latter seemed more pressing. If the North was overrun by Ironborn, what point was there in forging a new kingdom? Thus, Robb Stark began pulling his armies northward, leaving fewer men to guard the riverlands. Tywin's informants gleefully reported this development. It meant fewer battles for the Lannisters to fight. With the Tullys effectively isolated, it would be easier for the crown to subdue them. Word was sent to Riverrun: yield and be spared, or resist and face the combined might of the Lannisters and Tyrells. The Tully leadership, proud but aware of the precarious situation, wavered. Edmure Tully wanted to keep fighting, but the older lords pointed out that with Robb turning north and no hope of immediate reinforcements, the Tully cause was doomed. The phrase, notoriously opportunistic, finally made their move. Under the shadow of a peaceful parley, they seized key river lords who refused to bend the knee, offering them as captives to Tywin Lannister. In exchange, Walder Frey expected new titles and lands, which Tywin was all too happy to promise. Soon, Riverrun found itself blockaded. With little prospect of relief, the Tully banners came down, and the fish of Riverrun gave way to the Gold Lion. Edmure Tully was stripped of titles and kept as a hostage. Brynden Blackfish fled, disappearing into the wilderness. Some said he meant to go north and rejoin Robb. Others said he might gather outlaws and fight on as a rebel. Whatever the truth, the crown's victory over the Riverlands was nearly complete. In King's Landing, the news of Riverrun's capitulation was met with triumphant feasts. Joffrey crowed that he had crushed the traitors. Tywin accepted the praise stoically, aware that cunning and alliance had done more than open warfare. The Tyrells took the occasion to remind everyone that their presence had fed the city and freed the crown's armies to focus on other matters. Publicly, it was a grand success for the new regime. Privately, tensions persisted. The Lannister-Tyrell alliance was a formidable one, but each side remained wary of letting the other grow too strong. In the aftermath of these southern and central victories, the crown turned its eyes once more to Stannis Baratheon. The blockade of Dragonstone had endured. Supplies on the island must be running low, or so the Redwyne Admiral reported. A small council meeting was held to debate the next steps. Should they attempt a landing on Dragonstone? Risky. Stannis would fight ferociously on his rocky stronghold. Tyrion suggested luring Stannis out by feigning a weakness, but Tywin doubted the man would be so easily fooled. Olenna Tyrell pressed for an offer of clemency if Stannis would surrender. "He is nothing if not stubborn," Tywin replied. "He will not bend." Yet Mace Tyrell argued that a drawn-out siege could last years, draining resources unnecessarily. Amid these discussions, a letter arrived under mysterious circumstances. A raven that seemed to bear no official sigil but claimed to carry word from Dragonstone. The gist was that Stannis might be open to negotiation if certain conditions were met. The small council read it in perplexity. Was this a trap? Or had some within Stannis's camp grown weary of hunger and hopelessness, forging the letter in hopes of sparing themselves? Tyrion, for one, suspected the Red Priestess's hand in this, though he could not say why. Nonetheless, the crown had little to lose by responding. A party was sent under a flag of truce to parley at the water's edge. On the appointed day, only a few Tyrell and Lannister knights rowed ashore on a rocky strand of Dragonstone, accompanied by a handful of men-at-arms. They were met by Salador San, the Lysine pirate who had once served Stannis, and a single knight in battered armor. Negotiations were brief and inconclusive. Stannis, from behind the curtain of the parley tent, demanded that Joffrey renounce his crown as an abomination, that the realm acknowledge Stannis as the one true king by right. The crown's envoys laughed bitterly. No one would consider that. The meeting ended in acrimony, with the threat that the next time they approached Dragonstone, it would be with swords drawn. Thus, the final approach to ending Stannis' cause was set in motion. The Redwyne fleet prepared for an assault, likely focusing on the smaller, outlying forts on Dragonstone to gain a foothold. Once those were taken, they could slowly tighten the noose around Stannis' main keep. Tywin gave Mace Tyrell the honor of commanding the ground forces, eager to let the Tyrells do the dangerous and potentially costly fighting. Mace, proud and eager for glory, agreed. He also took it as a chance to prove the Tyrell martial prowess in front of the entire realm. Perhaps in the back of Olenna's mind, she worried about the risk, but outwardly, she supported her son. Ships from the Arbor and Old Town converged on Dragonstone, bristling with siege weaponry, accompanied by 1,000 Tyrell men. Over several weeks, they waged a slow campaign, capturing lesser outposts and seizing vantage points along the craggy coastline. Stannis' loyalists fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Rumors circulated of red magic used against the invaders, but if there were shadows creeping in the night, they did not halt the Tyrell advance. Perhaps Stannis' faith in Lawler was overshadowed by the simple fact that he lacked enough men to defend the entire island. Little by little, Mace Tyrell's forces pinned him inside the citadel of Dragonstone proper. Though Mace was inclined to starve Stannis out, several of his younger knights urged a direct assault. After all, the longer they delayed, the more chances there were for storms or sabotage. At last, Mace prepared for a final push. On a fog-shrouded morning, Tyrell banners advanced up the narrow causeway, while Redwyne archers pelted the walls with flaming arrows. Stannis himself stood atop the battlements, glowering. Defenders poured boiling oil and dropped rocks, but the Tyrell rams broke through a side gate. The fighting spilled into the courtyard. Mace Tyrell, in gilded armor, led a charge that pinned the remaining defenders against the keep's doors. In the swirl of battle, men shouted that Stannis was still inside. They battered down the door only to find it barred. Eventually, they used pickaxes to carve their way in. Within the gloom of the Great Hall, they came face to face with Stannis Baratheon, his sword drawn, the Red Priestess Melisandre at his side. She held a strange staff topped with a ruby that glowed faintly in the dim light. Stannis refused to surrender, launching himself at the intruders with a fury born of desperation. He fought until he was battered to his knees. Some say he cried out that he would never bow to a bastard king. Others say he merely bellowed curses. In the end, a Tyrell knight struck the sword from Stannis' hand, and he fell. Melisandre was seized and disarmed. Though her expression was unreadable, the anger in her eyes was said to be terrifying. Thus ended the last major threat to King Joffrey's reign in the south. The final Baratheon claimant was taken prisoner. Mace Tyrell, victorious, returned to King's Landing in triumph, parading his captives behind him. Stannis, bound in chains, looked gaunt but unbroken. The small folk turned out to gawk, hurling insults. Joffrey demanded that Stannis be brought before the Iron Throne in the throne room, so he could pronounce judgment personally. Tywin was content to let Joffrey have this moment of victory, as it would further cement the idea that the king was no longer a child. Marjorie, seated at Joffrey's side, wore a concerned expression, but kept her composure. The day Stannis Baratheon was led into the throne room, it was packed with lords, ladies, and courtiers eager to witness the downfall of the man many called the traitor. Joffrey, dressed in crimson and gold, with a golden crown gleaming atop his head, demanded that Stannis kneel. Stannis stood rigid. One could sense the tension. If Stannis refused, would Joffrey have him put to death on the spot? There was a hush. The Red Priestess Melisandre stood with her wrists bound, glaring at the courtiers. Stannis uttered, in a broken voice, "I will not kneel." Immediately, Joffrey's face twisted in anger. "Then die," the boy king spat. Perhaps there might have been a last-moment compromise, but none was given. The king's guard drew their blades. Stannis was forced to his knees by guards. Joffrey grinned, calling for Island Payne to do the honors. One swift stroke, and Stannis Baratheon's life ended. The Red Priestess cried out in some foreign tongue. Guards seized her, hauling her away for imprisonment. The hall echoed with the crowing laughter of Joffrey Baratheon. Margaery kept her gaze level, revealing little, though those closest to her saw a flicker of disquiet. With that execution, the southern front of the war was well and truly concluded. The Stormlands were pacified, the Crown's hold on King's Landing secure, and the Tyrell-Lannister alliance triumphant. Of the 5 kings who once vied for the throne, only 2 claimants remained in any real sense. Balon Greyjoy, self-styled King of the Isles in the north, and Robb Stark, King in the north. If one were to ask the small council, they would say that in truth, only Joffrey wore a crown recognized by the realm's leading powers. The others were pretenders doomed to fail. A sense of inevitability followed. Tywin turned his sights to the north, methodically planning how to extinguish Robb Stark's cause. But ironically, with the realm's southern half secure, the crown could afford a long wait. The Ironborn hammered away at the north. Robb Stark found it difficult to dislodge them, especially as many of his bannermen tired of war. The Karstarks deserted after a dispute regarding Jaime Lannister's captivity. Some northern lords died in skirmishes with the Ironborn. The royal scribes in King's Landing compiled news of each battle with quiet satisfaction. Queen Margaery oversaw the continued shipments of grain and provisions to the city, steadily endearing herself to the populace. As more time passed, the story of how quickly the Baratheons had been crushed became part of the new royal narrative. Bards sang songs of the mighty rose that aided the Golden Lion in taming the usurpers. People found it easier to forget the complexities. They remembered only that House Tyrell had helped House Lannister bring peace to King's Landing in record time. One day, as Margaery walked the palace gardens, those newly replanted with Highgarden's favorite blooms, she encountered Tyrion Lannister. The imp offered her a respectful bow. They spoke quietly among the roses, each aware that any conversation between them might be carried back to Tywin and Olenna. Nonetheless, Tyrion remarked that the city had not known peace and plenty like this in decades. Margaery responded with a smile, saying that as queen, she wanted to see all the people prosper. Tyrion, ever the cynic, said, "A noble ambition, your grace. But the small folks' memory can be short. Should a new war or crisis appear, they'll curse us as quickly as they once cheered us." Margaery tilted her head, acknowledging the truth of that, but replied that if the crown secured lasting stability, there needn't be a crisis. And with both the lion and the rose entwined, she said, "Who would dare challenge us?" Tyrion could think of a few. The North, the Ironborn, perhaps even Daenerys Targaryen across the Narrow Sea if rumors of her existence were true. But he only nodded. Meanwhile, Olenna Tyrell kept a careful watch on Margaery's marriage. She had not missed the cruelty that simmered beneath Joffrey's surface. Her granddaughter was adept at flattery and deflection, but Joffrey was prone to tantrums that no gentle word could always quell. Olenna made sure to keep trusted Tyrell guards near Margaery at all times, subtly stationed in the Red Keep. She also made sure that, should anything happen to Margaery, the crown would deeply regret it. Tywin recognized that threat. He had no wish to break the alliance that had served him so well, so a quiet equilibrium endured. In the Riverlands, a wave of opportunistic Lannister bannermen took advantage of the Tully surrender to seize lands and exact vengeance for old slights. The small folk, who had suffered under repeated raids, grew bitter. Some turned outlaw, forming scattered bands that attacked any travelers, be they Lannister or Tyrell. The crown sent out soldiers to restore order, but the Riverlands had long known strife, and it would be many months before the roads were safe. Nonetheless, the realm as a whole saw far less devastation than it might have if the Baratheons had not been crushed so early. The Tyrell gold kept the supply lines open, so famine was averted. Tywin's iron fist deterred most lords from open rebellion. And yet, across the sea, whispers of dragons grew. Daenerys Targaryen had hatched 3 dragons in the Red Waste and made her way to Qarth. If those rumors were to be believed, perhaps one day she would come west to reclaim the Iron Throne. For now, though, that was a distant worry. The small council had more immediate concerns. Namely, whether to march north and force Robb Stark to bend the knee, or let the Ironborn do all the dirty work. In the end, Tywin decided on a more cautious approach. He let the North bleed. The Crown publicly decreed that if Robb Stark surrendered, recognized Joffrey's authority, and returned Jaime Lannister safely, the North would be granted lenient terms. But Tywin knew Robb Stark's pride would not let him do that, at least not so easily. And so the war in the North dragged on, mostly overshadowed by the Ironborn invasions. Occasionally, ravens brought tidings of a northern victory, or a skirmish retaken from the Ironborn. Now and again, Tywin would dispatch a small force to raid the Riverland's northern edges, hoping to hamper any Tully loyalists who might try to support Robb. But all told, the Crown's campaign slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, life in King's Landing assumed a new normal. The wedding euphoria gave way to daily routine. Margaery performed her queenly duties with grace, hosting ladies from across the realm, forging alliances with them, and discreetly sending out gifts to secure friendships. Cersei brooded on the sidelines, overshadowed. Joffrey enjoyed playing the king at times, delighting in condemning criminals to gruesome ends. Occasionally, he threatened to resume a more brutal approach to amuse himself, but Margaery and Tywin kept him mostly in check. Tyrion oversaw the city's finances, a difficult task considering the extravagance of the court, but Olenna Tyrell's financial savvy often saved the day, as she found new sources of revenue. Peter Baelish, for his part, sulked at being displaced, but he was too cunning to vanish altogether. He continued to cultivate alliances with lesser lords and run his brothels. The aftermath for House Tyrell was one of ascendancy. With little direct conflict ravaging their lands and the Stormlands subjugated, their influence soared. Every Highgarden banquet bustled with newly minted knights, southern ladies eager for matches, and merchants flush with coin. The Tyrell men who had fought under Mace returned with war stories, praising the Tyrell name. Randyll Tarly, that grim and fearsome commander, found new respect from many who once doubted him. Even the lesser lords who had clung to Renly quietly reintegrated, sensing that the future lay with the Rose and the Lion. Within Highgarden itself, Olenna Tyrell occasionally mused on the future. Though they were now allied with the Lannisters, she knew history's lessons well. Alliances seldom endured forever, especially if one side outgrew the other in power. The Tyrells had given their sweet rose, Margaery, to Joffrey Baratheon, a boy with cruelty in his veins. One day, might Margaery find herself in mortal danger? Olenna intended to ensure that never happened. She began weaving further layers of contingency, discreetly forging ties with the Martells of Dorne and even some disaffected lords in the Crownlands. Should the day come when the Tyrells had to stand alone, she wanted to be ready. For the moment, they would enjoy their seat of power. In the Red Keep, the Queen of Thorns maintained her own suite of rooms, richly furnished with Highgarden tapestries. Visitors came to pay respects, for she was half-queen in the city by virtue of her granddaughter's status. Even Cersei occasionally had to call upon her, albeit with a forced smile. Olenna took delight in gently mocking the Queen Regent's chilly demeanor and overprotective love for Joffrey. Cersei, who prided herself on her sharp tongue, found Olenna an even sharper blade. More than one confrontation ended with Cersei storming away in fury, while Olenna sipped tea unruffled. Tywin, for his part, managed the broad strokes of governance, content that the most pressing rebellions were subdued. He still held Sansa Stark as a valuable piece for a future marriage alliance, either to keep the North in check or to draw another great house closer. He still had to retrieve Jaime from captivity, but with Robb Stark pinned in the North, that would eventually happen, either through negotiation or an exchange of hostages. Time was on Tywin's side, or so he believed. And indeed, though the war was not fully concluded in the north, the crown's hold on the southern half of Westeros had never been stronger. By crushing the Baratheons early, Tywin and Olenna had carved a swift path to stability. Many a lord in King's Landing congratulated themselves on living in an era that might soon be free of major conflict. Yet, in the shadows of the realm, fresh seeds of turmoil sprouted. Ambition and vengeance did not die so easily. The Tyrells and Lannisters might grow suspicious of one another's growing power. The North might never forget its dead and dishonored. The Greyjoys might decide that the North is only the beginning. And across the sea, 3 dragons grew in both size and legend, carried by a young Targaryen queen who had been robbed of her birthright. All of that, however, remained beyond the immediate horizon. For the moment, the capital glittered with gold and roses, basking in the triumphant knowledge that rebellion had been quelled before it could truly devour the kingdoms. The Tyrells were hailed as saviors by the small folk. The Lannisters, though still feared, were recognized as the ultimate authority. And Joffrey, fickle, savage, but crowned, reigned over it all, outwardly unchallenged. On a crisp morning when the first autumn wind rattled the castle windows, Margaery stood on one of the Red Keep's balconies, overlooking the city she had helped secure. King's Landing stretched below her, the roofs of Flea Bottom crowded, the docks bustling with ships. She could smell the tang of salt air from Blackwater Bay mixed with the faint perfume of the rose garden behind her. In the distance, she glimpsed the great September of Baelor's domed roof, glinting in the sunlight. In her hand, she held a rose from Highgarden, a symbol of her house. Nearby, a Lannister guard, wearing gold-trimmed armor, stood silent watch. She sighed softly, lost in thought. She had ascended to queen faster than she had ever expected. Just months ago, she had been poised to wed Renly. Now he was dead, and she was Joffrey's wife. The realm had changed in a flash, molded by her grandmother's cunning, Tywin's iron discipline, and a swift and brutal campaign. She closed her eyes, thinking of what the future might bring. House Tyrell had climbed to the pinnacle, yet it was perched on a precarious edge, joined at the hip with the Lannisters. Should that bond ever fray, the fall might be catastrophic. For now, though, the realm was mostly at peace, or as close to peace as Westeros ever came. The Stormlands had been subdued, the capital was secure, and the name Baratheon carried little weight after the demise of both Renly and Stannis. The young queen opened her eyes to gaze upon the city. There was power in that vista, countless thousands of souls, now beneath her husband's rule and, in truth, beneath her influence. She placed the rose in the folds of her gown, stepped back inside the royal apartments, and prepared for another day of being the realm's beloved queen. Yet she remembered Olenna's words, "Never forget that every rose has its thorns. Use them if you must." Thus, the what-if scenario played out in ways both beneficial and ominous. Olenna Tyrell's cunning alliance with Tywin Lannister had indeed crushed the Baratheons early, saving King's Landing from the siege and chaos that might have been. It ensured House Tyrell's fortunes soared, quickly establishing Margaery as queen. Yet the cost was manifold. The Stormlands were subdued under a boy king notorious for cruelty, and the North was left to wage its own desperate war with little chance of outside aid. The seeds of future discord lay beneath the surface, needing only time and the right spark to emerge. But for now, in the hush of the autumn wind, the Red Keep stood tall, crowned with banners of gold and roses, and the Iron Throne belonged to House Baratheon Lannister in name, and to House Tyrell in quiet influence. So ended the second year of King Joffrey's reign, with feasts and victory songs echoing through the halls, while Westeros awaited the next turn of the wheel. Because, as every courtier whispered in corners, peace under such an alliance could not last forever. Cersei Lannister walked through the torchlit corridors of the Red Keep, her footfalls echoing off the cold stone. The hush of the hour lay over King's Landing, and outside, a late autumn wind whispered across the Blackwater Bay. Even in the gloom, her golden hair caught what little light there was, reflecting it in ripples of brightness. She moved with agitated purpose, clutching the folds of her thick robe. The day's feasting was done. Once more, Joffrey had presided over the court with his queen, Margaery Tyrell, at his side. Cersei had smiled dutifully throughout, offering polite laughter at Margaery's remarks, though each courtesy had felt like a fresh indignity. The Stormlands were subdued. Stannis Baratheon was gone, beheaded in this very throne room, while Joffrey had crowed with triumph and Margaery observed from the dais. Now the city was full of talk of the North, the Ironborn, and any number of future conflicts. Cersei cared only that the Tyrell queen had begun to overshadow her, taking on tasks that once fell to the queen regent. That thought festered like a wound in her mind. She had asked for a private audience with her father. Lord Tywin seldom met with anyone at such an hour unless he deemed it critical. That he had agreed so quickly suggested that he, too, had concerns. Cersei paused before the door to his solar, took a breath, and pushed it open. The chamber was lit by a single lantern on the oaken table. Tywin stood behind it, clad in a robe of black velvet. He looked up from a sheaf of parchment, his green eyes severe. "Close the door," he said without ceremony. Cersei complied. The latch clicked into place, sealing them off from the prying ears of the Red Keep spies. At once she launched into her complaint, voice cracking with pent-up tension. "Father, I cannot abide this any longer. Margaery Tyrell usurps my place at every turn. She fosters her own network of informants. She parades about the city winning hearts, and Joffrey is so besotted with her that he barely heeds my counsel." Tywin carefully laid down his quill. If the boy shows more regard for his queen than his mother, that is hardly surprising. You were the one who insisted you had his best interests at heart when we arranged this marriage. Her mouth twisted. It was necessary for the alliance, but I did not foresee how quickly the Tyrell girl and her wretched grandmother would twist everything to their advantage. Margaery stamps bread with her sigil and hands it to the poor. She steps in when Joffrey grows bored or angry, always guiding him back to composure. The small folk fawn over her as though she's the true ruler of the realm. Tywin steepled his fingers. She is a symbol and an effective one. You must see the value of that. Better the crowds cheer for Margaery and, by extension, cheer for the crown. When the people are content, they are less likely to rebel. Content, Cersei echoed bitterly. I suppose it works. While she's busy playing the benevolent queen, I watch my own place in court erode. The southern lords prefer to speak with her and that old crone Olenna. Even Sansa Stark thinks to cling to Margaery's skirts, if the girl had any sense. Tywin's expression did not change. Your role remains vital, Cersei. You are the king's mother, and regent in all but name. However, we must acknowledge that House Tyrell proved indispensable in the war's early phase. They provided the ships, the armies, and the provisions that allowed us to subdue Renly and Stannis Baratheon before they could truly threaten the city. As a result, they demand recognition, and we must grant them enough so that they remain content. If you were to attempt to undermine Margaery openly, it would do us more harm than good. That does not mean I am blind to the Tyrell ambition. I am well aware of Olenna's cunning and Mace Tyrell's vanity. I will not just stand by while they insinuate themselves deeper, Cersei said. We must act. Tywin's voice sharpened. Act how? Shall we discard the alliance that we forged at great cost? Shall we provoke a new war with the largest army in the south? That would be madness. I only mean that we should not let them grow so powerful, she said. Look at them. They have the Redwine fleet at their disposal. They distribute the realm's grain, they hold Storm's End, and they have replaced many crown officers with their own. Randall Tarley and Mathis Rowan are being given prominent roles in the king's councils. Mace Tyrell struts about as if he will be the next hand. She lowered her voice. And you have not named a hand since you returned to the capital, father. Some wonder why. Are you waiting for your moment to name yourself? Or do you still intend to remain the true power behind the throne, no matter the official title? Tywin studied her, perhaps weighing how much to reveal. At length, he said, the Tyrells have a critical function. For the moment, their presence benefits us. But there will come a time, perhaps sooner than they expect, when the balance tips. The North remains an open question. I intend to see how that ends before making any grand gesture here. Cersei's lips pressed into a thin line. You believe Robb Stark will continue battling the Ironborn, bleeding himself dry, and then we march in and crush whatever remains. Precisely, Tywin said, and once the North is subdued or brought to heel, if they are wise enough to bend the knee, our power will be unassailable. At that point, the Tyrells may find it less advantageous to challenge our influence in court. The dragons never had an equal in the days of Aegon's conquest. We must do likewise, ensuring no combination of houses can threaten us. Cersei stood there silently for a moment. The torch sputtered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. She disliked the notion of waiting patiently while Margaery Tyrell garnered love and admiration. But Tywin's logic was unassailable. So we wait. Very well. I only hope the Tyrells do not spin webs of their own in the meantime, webs that prove difficult to undo. Tywin's voice was crisp. You will keep your eyes open. That is your task. Of course, father. She inclined her head. But do not ask me to smile sweetly at that girl. I cannot. Smiling sweetly was never your strength, Tywin said, almost an afterthought. He turned back to his parchments, clearly dismissing her. Cersei left in a swirl of robes, her mind boiling with resentments. As she passed down the corridors, she caught the half-bowed forms of Lannister guards. They saluted her, murmuring, "Your Grace," as if she were queen in truth, but the real queen sat in a chamber decorated with golden roses. The thought rankled. Outside, the autumn wind sighed across the castle ramparts. Margaery Tyrell's morning routine began at sunrise. She took her breakfast in a small antechamber of Maegor's Holdfast, accompanied by two young ladies in waiting, one from House Fossaway, the other from House Mullendore. A subtle infiltration of the Reach's gentleborn ladies had found their way to King's Landing, and Margaery used them carefully. Each served as a set of eyes and ears, relaying rumor and gossip from every corner of the court. This morning, over a delicate meal of fruit tarts and honeyed porridge, Margaery found her mind wandering back to the day she first set foot in the Red Keep as Joffrey's betrothed. She remembered the sense of stepping into a lion's den, both figuratively and literally. The presence of the Lannisters was palpable. Cersei had regarded her like one might a potential assassin, eyes suspicious, lips tight. Joffrey had stared at her with a hungry curiosity. Tyrion had offered a polite, ambiguous courtesy. The old lion, Tywin, had been as forbidding as a statue of black marble. Now, with Renly Baratheon and Stannis both gone, Margaery's position was secure, at least for the moment. She wore the crown. She had a seat at Joffrey's side. Her grandmother, Olenna, had arrived soon after the wedding, ensuring that House Tyrell's foothold in the capital was absolute. Still, Margaery knew how precarious power could be. King's Landing was an ever-shift. Ting Labyrinth and alliances here were as fluid as water. A rap at the door interrupted her thoughts. One of her ladies moved to answer. Ser Loras Tyrell entered in his Kingsguard whites, immaculate, perfectly fitted. His face was a stony mask, though his eyes softened a little when he looked at Margaery. "Sister," he said, inclining his head, though he had no need to bow to a queen who was also his blood. "Ser Loras, how fares your morning watch?" she asked in a gentle tone. "All is well. The city is quiet, for once. But the Red Keep is never entirely silent. I come to tell you that the king requests your presence in the courtyard after breakfast. There is to be a display of archery." Margaery offered a small smile. "Joffrey never tires of watching men compete for his amusement. Tell me, dear brother, does he plan to join in the competition? He fancies himself a fine shot." Loras's expression flickered. "He might. Whether he has skill is another matter. But if I were you, I would compliment his every arrow." She rose from her seat, smoothing her gown of pale green silk. "You need not remind me how to stroke the king's vanity," she teased gently. But beneath her light tone lay a thread of tension. She could not allow Joffrey to feel slighted. He was dangerous in the smallest slights. Loras inclined his head. "I only meant to caution you. You know how he can be." I do. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his cheek. And how are you, brother? I see the tension in your eyes. Is your service to the King's Guard so trying? He lowered his gaze. I swore vows. I will uphold them, for the honor of our house. But I will never forget. He trailed off. In that silence, Marjorie felt the echo of Renly's name, the memory of Renly's death. She squeezed Loras's hand gently, offering him wordless comfort. She dismissed her ladies and took Loras's arm, letting him escort her through the corridors. Along the way, she passed other members of the royal household. Some whispered greetings, others bowed. She caught glimpses of the new servants who had come from Highgarden to ensure her personal comfort. The Red Keep was a swirl of color and crests these days. Golden lions, golden roses, and the stags of House Baratheon, overshadowed by the alliance that had brought them here. In the courtyard, they found Joffrey already waiting. He wore a rich doublet of crimson, embroidered with lions, and a golden quiver at his hip. Several archery targets had been set up along the far wall. Members of the court gathered at a safe distance, forming a loose semicircle, prepared to applaud at the king's every shot. Marjorie, Joffrey called, voice high and eager. He beckoned her forward. She curtsied gracefully, though her eyes darted to the crossbow in his hands. He seemed to prefer that to a traditional bow. You honor me by summoning me, your grace, she said, modulating her tone to just the right pitch of admiration. I hear we are to be entertained by feats of skill? Joffrey smirked. Yes, I've been training, you know. The King's Guard have taught me much, but they always worry about safety. I want to show everyone how a real king wields a weapon. A hush fell as he took his position, one foot planted forward, crossbow lifted. The crowd watched, bracing themselves in case Joffrey's aim veered dangerously. He took aim at a straw-stuffed target shaped roughly like a deer. Then, with a quick pull of the trigger, the bolt whizzed across the courtyard. It struck the target near the neck, a foot away from the center, but not a total miss. A polite spatter of applause followed. Marjorie smiled. That was very fine, your grace. Your skill is evident. He puffed out his chest. I'll do better. He motioned to a servant to hand him another bolt. Meanwhile, Marjorie surreptitiously exchanged glances with Ser Loras, who stood behind the king watchful. Loras gave a tiny shrug. As the morning wore on, Joffrey fired bolt after bolt. The crowd politely murmured their approval. Now and then, a crossbowman from the Gold Cloaks demonstrated a sharper aim, though Joffrey never seemed to notice that the lesser men outscored him. Marjorie clapped her hands and offered compliments, ensuring Joffrey's temper remained in check. Cersei arrived midway, her expression taut. She watched her son with an indulgent smile that never reached her eyes, nodding whenever he looked her way. Marjorie sensed the older woman's simmering resentment, but she maintained her polite exterior. When the display finally ended, Joffrey dismissed the onlookers. Marjorie and Cersei followed him inside, side by side, while Loras trailed at a respectful distance. Near the doors of the throne room, Cersei leaned in with a smile that felt like a blade. Such a lovely morning, don't you think? She said. Indeed, Marjorie replied, meeting her gaze with a measured calm. His Grace performed admirably. Cersei arched a brow. I wonder if you might join me for a brief conversation later. There are certain matters of the ladies' court I'd like to discuss. It was an unusual request. Cersei seldom invited Marjorie to anything private. Marjorie inclined her head. Of course, your grace. I shall be pleased to do so. Excellent. With a tight smile, Cersei turned and swept down another corridor, her retinue of Lannister guards following. Marjorie let out a quiet breath, telling herself not to dwell on what new snare Cersei might be setting. So much of this life was navigating tensions, yet it was far better than any alternative. She had once, in her girlish innocence, believed Renly's path to the throne would be easy, a shining path of chivalry. That dream had died with him. Now she walked a more perilous route, but she had her grandmother's guidance, her brother's protection, and her own cunning. If Cersei had plans, Marjorie would be ready. That afternoon, Tyrion Lannister sat in his solar near the royal library, poring over ledgers. The updated accounts from Mace Tyrell's storming of Dragonstone had come in. It turned out that paying for multiple siege engines, their crews, and the associated fleets was no small matter. The crown's debts were staggering, even with the Tyrells providing steady shipments of food and certain loans. Tyrion sipped wine, rolling it around his tongue, allowing a moment's pleasure before burying himself in more sums. A knock sounded at his door. "Enter," he called. The door creaked open, revealing Bronn, newly outfitted in a finer doublet than usual. He made a half-bow that was more mocking than reverent. "Sorry to disturb your counting, my lord, but you've got a visitor." Tyrion frowned. "Who?" "Your sister, the Queen Regent." Tyrion's eyebrows rose. Cersei rarely came to him unless it was to give an order or deliver a rebuke. "Show her in." Moments later, Cersei glided into the room, the Lannister red of her gown accentuating the pale gold of her hair. She spared only a cursory glance at Bronn, who smirked, then withdrew, closing the door. Tyrion set aside his ledger. "Sister, this is a surprise. To what do I owe the honor?" Cersei's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Must I always have an ulterior motive to visit my dear brother?" "Experience suggests yes," Tyrion said lightly. "But please have a seat. Would you like wine?" She declined with a wave. "No, I won't linger. I came to inform you that Father has decided the small council will convene tomorrow to discuss the matter of the North. We have fresh ravens from the Westerlands. I'm told you've been requesting updates about Jaime's captivity." A muscle tightened in Tyrion's face. "Yes, well, I'd like to know whether my brother is faring better than a prisoner might. Have we had any direct word from him?" "None of late," Cersei said, her tone clipped. "But apparently, Robb Stark's forays against the Ironborn have forced him to relocate Jaime. There are rumors he's moved him to some hidden location, possibly to prevent a rescue." Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. "I see. I'd hoped we might open negotiations more directly. A trade, perhaps. Sansa Stark for Jaime. It would be the easiest path to securing his freedom." "Sansa is a valuable pawn," Cersei said. "Or so Father believes. He prefers to wait. Once the North crumbles, whether by our hand or the Ironborns, Robb Stark will have no choice but to come begging for terms. Then we can name our price." Tyrion's mouth twisted. "And in the meantime, Jaime rots in a dungeon. You do not worry about his condition." Cersei's green eyes hardened. "Of course I worry, Tyrion. He's my twin. But we must trust Father's strategy. He's guided us this far, and it has worked. The Tyrell alliance gave us King's Landing, gave us the Stormlands. Now it is giving us time. The North is not an immediate threat. And if the Ironborn entrench themselves so deeply that Balon Greyjoy effectively becomes unstoppable at sea, will we then face a new threat from that quarter?" She shrugged. "That is for the next council to consider. The Red Wine fleet is formidable. So is our coin. Pirates, sell-sails, they all bow to gold in the end. The Ironborn are reavers, but we can outlast them if it comes to that. Or let the North drown them in blood." Tyrion swallowed a mouthful of wine. "You sound almost cheerful at the notion of these endless wars. So long as they remain far from the capital, I suppose it's not our immediate concern." Cersei's smile was thin. "Precisely. I also wanted to speak to you about the Tyrell Queen. Marjorie." "Ah, I wondered when you'd bring her up." Tyrion set down his goblet. "Is she causing trouble again?" "That is precisely what I can't determine," Cersei said with a flicker of irritation. "On the surface, she's all sweetness and virtue. She feeds the poor, charms the lords, soothes Joffrey's temper. But behind that mask, I'm certain she plots to elevate her own house above ours." Tyrion tilted his head. "I don't doubt House Tyrell's ambitions, but at present, we are allied. I know Father does not wish that alliance disturbed." Cersei paced to the window, looking out over the courtyard where Joffrey had recently held his archery display. "Alliances can sour. When that time comes, I want to be certain we have an advantage. Do you have any leads on their possible treacheries?" He spread his hands. "I am not Varys, dear sister, nor am I Littlefinger. My gifts lie in administration and negotiation. Still, I can keep my ears open." She tapped her manicured fingers on the windowsill. "Do so, and watch Sansa Stark as well. She seems taken by Marjorie, sees her as some kindly older sister. That relationship could become dangerous if the Tyrells plan to manipulate Sansa's claim to the north." Tyrion suppressed a sigh. Sansa's claim. If Robb Stark dies, indeed, Sansa might be the next in line for Winterfell. But that is a labyrinth all its own. Cersei turned, her gaze lingering on him. "Just remember that House Lannister stands above all. If the Tyrells or the North try any cunning moves, we must be prepared." With that, she swept out of the room, leaving Tyrion to rub his temples. He wondered how many hidden battles he would have to fight to maintain the balance in King's Landing. A small part of him wished that, once Jaime was freed, he could slip away from the city altogether. But that was a child's dream. He was a Lannister, and his father would not allow him to run from responsibility. He went back to the ledgers, forcing himself to focus on the endless columns of numbers. The crown was so deeply in debt that the Iron Bank of Bravos might soon demand repayment. That was another storm looming on the horizon. Far from the capital, in the Wolfswood near Winterfell, Robb Stark guided his horse through a narrow deer trail. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a far cry from the perfumed corridors of King's Landing. He had once dreamed of traveling south to see the wonders of the capital under peaceful terms. Now, after so many battles, that dream felt childish. He paused, letting gray wind sniff at the forest floor. The direwolf's ears twitched, picking up distant sounds. A party of northern scouts flanked Robb, each clad in cloaks suited for the woodlands. Among them was his mother, Catelyn Stark, who had insisted on coming north with him after they realized how dire the Ironborn threat had become. "Any sign of them?" Catelyn asked in a low voice. Robb shook his head. "Not yet. The Ironborn Reavers don't usually come this deep into the woods unless they're pursuing something. We suspect they landed at Deepwood Motte. Lady Glover's ravens told us they sacked a village near the shore. We'll come at them from the flank." He urged his horse forward again. The tension in him was a constant companion. How had it come to this? He was called king in the north, yet most of his days were spent responding to attacks on his own land by Greyjoy scum. The war in the Riverlands, meant to avenge his father's death, had ground to a near standstill. House Frey's treachery had cut his supply lines, and with House Tyrell choosing to side with the Lannisters, there was little chance the Southern Lords would help him. He clenched his jaw. The moment he had learned that House Tyrell betrayed Renly and allied with the Lannisters, he understood how precarious his position was. Once, he had imagined forging an alliance with Renly or perhaps remaining neutral while the Baratheon armies clashed with the Lannisters. That possibility had vanished in a single stroke. The Tyrells had crushed Renly early, then Stannis. Joffrey ruled King's Landing unopposed. In the meantime, the North struggled under dual pressures. The Lannisters from the south, though they had slowed their aggression recently, and the Ironborn from the west. "What of your wife?" Catelyn asked softly after a pause. "Lady Talisa. She's at Moat Cailin?" Robb nodded. "Yes, I left her there. It's safer behind the fortifications, though safe is a relative term. The Ironborn are cunning. I just pray they don't circle around by sea. Our navy is nearly non-existent." They pressed deeper into the Wolfswood. Eventually, they came across a band of battered peasants. Men, women, and children who had fled the raided hamlet. Robb dismounted to speak with them. One old man, leaning on a staff, recounted the Ironborn's arrival at dawn, torching houses, stealing livestock, and dragging off any young women or strong men they fancied. Robb's face grew grim as he listened. "We'll drive them out," he promised. "There will be justice." The old man nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "Thank you, my lord, your grace," he corrected, stumbling over the form of address. Robb closed his eyes briefly, fighting the sense of helplessness that dogged him. He had become king to protect his people and avenge his father. Yet half the realm was out of his reach. The Ironborn ships gave them an advantage he could not easily negate. Meanwhile, the Lannisters and Tyrells grew stronger every day in the south. Catelyn touched his arm. "Hope remains, Robb. The north is vast, and the Ironborn are few. Sooner or later, they'll be worn down." He nodded, though her words only half comforted him. The north was indeed vast, but that also meant it was nearly impossible to defend every shore, every village. Balon Greyjoy's strategy was to scatter Robb's forces, forcing him to fight 100 little battles. They pressed on, eventually finding the Ironborn encampment near a rocky outcropping. Robb and his men approached with caution, dividing into 2 groups to surround the enemy. The clash that followed was brutal but swift, with the Northerners overwhelming the smaller group of raiders. By dusk, the Ironborn survivors had either fled or lay dead on the pine-needled ground. As Robb wiped his sword clean, he felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. Victory here, in this patch of forest, meant little in the grand scheme if the Ironborn landed again somewhere else tomorrow. That night, he and his mother made camp beneath tall pines, a light snow drifting from an iron-gray sky. Around their campfires, men huddled for warmth. Catelyn sat beside him, her expression weary. "My son," she said, her voice low, "we cannot keep living like this forever. Are you certain there's no chance of an accord with the crown? No terms we can accept?" He turned his head sharply. "Accept terms from the Lannisters? They killed father. They hold Sansa hostage. They destroyed the Riverlands, and they refuse to acknowledge the North's independence. I see no terms that would honor our cause." She touched his hand. "I understand, but I also see our men dying, our land burning. Winter is coming, truly. If we do not find a path to end this conflict, the North will starve." Robb stared into the flames. He remembered being a boy, leaning on his father's knee, hearing stories of honor and justice. Could he cling to that sense of honor now? Or was his mother right, that an accommodation might spare thousands of lives? In his heart, he knew the Lannisters would never offer a peace he could accept, not while they held so many advantages. Even if he wanted to bend the knee, he doubted Tywin Lannister would free Jaime without a punishing price that would undermine House Stark's position. "We will see," Robb said eventually, unwilling to commit to a course. Catelyn sighed. "Yes, we will." In the far southwestern corner of the realm, Old Town stood as a bastion of learning, commerce, and faith. The towering high tower caught the final rays of sunset each day, shining like a beacon for passing ships. Upon its docks, cargo from the Reach's fields and orchards arrived in abundance. House Tyrell's presence was heavily felt here. The Redwynes anchored their galleys in the harbor, ensuring the sea lanes remained under Tyrell dominion. That day, Lady Olenna Tyrell traveled to Old Town in a comfortable wheelhouse, accompanied by a retinue of guards and servants. She claimed she needed a respite from the stink of King's Landing and wanted to oversee certain negotiations personally. Rumor had it she would also meet with the High Septon, forging ties between the faith and House Tyrell. When the wheelhouse rolled to a stop at Old Town's gates, Lady Olenna disembarked, her sharp eyes sweeping the scene. A small delegation welcomed her, including Lord Leighton Hightower himself, though the aging Lord seldom left his tower. This was an honor few received. Lady Olenna, wise enough to appreciate courtesy, offered him a gracious greeting, though her words still carried her signature barbs. "Oh, Lord Hightower, how courteous of you to greet a tired old lady in the midst of your busy schedule," she said, letting him kiss her hand. "I trust the great library still has room for a traveling grandmother to rest her aching feet?" Lord Hightower, unaccustomed to her wit, managed a polite chuckle. "It does indeed. I've prepared guest quarters for you, and dinner awaits once you've settled." "Wonderful," she gestured to her knights to follow. As they made their way inside, she noted the thick walls, the careful watch kept by Hightower guards. Old Town had not seen major conflict in this war, thanks to the Tyrell alliance with the Lannisters. It remained a vital port, unscathed by ravaging armies. At dinner, Lady Olenna sat across from Lord Hightower, sipping a fine arbor red while an array of dishes, roast duck, spiced beets, and honeyed pears, were served. The conversation was polite at first. Trivialities about the harvest, the new growth of apple orchards, the shipping routes. But when the servants withdrew and the main course was finished, Olenna leaned in. "I hear tell that Prince Doran Martell has been corresponded with you," she said bluntly, swirling her wine. Lord Hightower looked startled. "Where did you hear that, my lady?" She laughed lightly. "I hear everything, dear. Now don't fret. I'm not about to cause a stir. I merely wish to know what Prince Doran says." Hightower cleared his throat. "He speaks of justice, of the old grievances, Elia Martell, her children, and the injustice done to them by the Lannisters in the sack of King's Landing. He asks if the Reach might support Dorne's demands for redress." Olenna gave a mild hum. "The Martells hold grudges like few others. If they have not joined in open rebellion thus far, it is because they wait for the right moment. Or they fear the combined might of House Tyrell and House Lannister. Still, Doran Martell is patient, cautious. He wants concessions." Lord Hightower nodded. He indicated that if the Crown offered a formal apology or recognized certain rights of Dorne, he might refrain from stirring any troubles. Olenna sipped her wine. Yes, well, Tywin Lannister would rather eat his own boots than apologize for that fiasco. However, times change and alliances shift. House Tyrell is not blind. We remember that it was the Lannisters who engineered that slaughter. I was in Highgarden at the time, but I recall the horror all the same. "So you would make common cause with the Martells?" Lord Hightower asked, his voice low. She waved a hand dismissively. "It is too early for that. For now, we Tyrells stand with the Crown. But if, say, King Joffrey proves dangerously unstable, or if the Lannisters become too overbearing, we might wish to have options. Dorne could be an option. They detest the Lannisters. They might welcome an alliance that weakens Tywin's power." Hightower's brow furrowed. "That is a perilous path, my lady. The realm is only just settling from the War of the Five Kings." "For kings now," Olenna corrected with a wry twist of her lips. "Renly and Stannis are quite dead, courtesy of our timely alliance. Balon Greyjoy is a nuisance, but hardly a threat to the south. Young Robb Stark remains, but he's far away, busy with Ironborn. No, the real question is not about immediate war, it's about the future. The Tyrells have gained much from this marriage, but we must ensure we do not find ourselves overshadowed." Hightower offered a cautious smile. "Then you have come seeking a friend in me, no doubt." "Indeed, House Hightower is proud, ancient, and wealthy. You have close ties to the faith, and your seat at Oldtown is a great center of learning. Should we Tyrells find ourselves in need of strengthening alliances within the Reach, we look to you first." He nodded slowly. "I see. Excellent," Olenna said, setting her cup down. "And just to be clear, we need not speak of betrayal. Merely readiness. If the Lannisters one day forget how essential we are, or if they place Marjorie in peril, we will want to act swiftly. I would hope House Hightower and other honorable houses of the Reach would stand with us." A thoughtful silence fell. In that hush, Olenna's mind turned to King's Landing and the precarious position Marjorie occupied. So far, the young queen had charmed nearly everyone. But Joffrey's moods were volatile, and Cersei's hostility was no secret. If a crisis erupted, Marjorie might be in danger overnight. Olenna intended never to let that happen. Lord Hightower finally cleared his throat. "We respect House Tyrell as our liege lord. You may depend on our loyalty." Olenna smiled. "Splendid. Now, enough talk of politics. Let us move on to dessert. I hear the spiced wine pears are especially fine this year." Back in King's Landing, Marjorie entered Cersei's solar at the appointed hour. The sun had just slipped behind the walls, and the last orange rays illuminated the chamber's tall windows. Cersei stood by the fireplace, hands folded, her posture rigid as she turned at the Queen's arrival. "You summoned me, Your Grace," Marjorie said with a curtsy. Cersei inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Yes, thank you for coming." She motioned to a pair of chairs near a small table, upon which a decanter of wine sat with 2 cups. "Sit." Marjorie did so, arranging her skirts neatly. "This is quite cozy," she observed, masking her wariness with pleasant chatter. A private conversation is a welcome change from the crowd of courtiers. Cersei settled opposite, pouring them each a cup of wine. "I find large gatherings tiresome, full of sycophants and flatterers." Marjorie accepted the cup but did not drink immediately. "Yes, at times it can be quite draining. I often find solitude refreshing. But you wished to speak, so here I am." Cersei studied her with a gaze that reminded Marjorie of a cat sizing up its prey. "There is a matter concerning the royal children, the future children, that is. You and Joffrey have been wed for some time, yet I see no sign of an heir." Marjorie maintained her composure, though her heart thumped. "That is in the hands of the gods, is it not? We have scarcely been married a year. In time, I hope to provide his grace with an heir to secure the succession." Cersei's fingers tapped the rim of her cup. "Indeed, we all hope so. The realm expects it. Perhaps you would consider certain potions or remedies known to aid fertility. The Grand Maester might advise you." Marjorie smiled politely. "I appreciate your concern, but I trust in the maiden's blessing, and I am certain that in time we will have good news to share." "See that you do," Cersei said, her voice cool. A tense silence followed. Marjorie set aside her cup, deciding to steer the conversation. "Was that all you wished to discuss, Your Grace?" A tight smile curved Cersei's lips. "You are direct. I appreciate that. But no, there is another matter. I thought it might be beneficial for you to spend more time with Sansa Stark. She is lonely, far from her family. Perhaps you could be a mentor to her." Marjorie feigned surprise. "But I already speak with Sansa often. We pray together in the sept. We exchange little bits of needlework. She is a sweet girl." "Are you suggesting something more formal?" "Yes, I want you to keep a close eye on her. Sansa is not cunning by nature, but she's still a Stark, and that means she has value. It might be wise for the crown to ensure she remains content in King's Landing." Marjorie heard the subtext. Cersei wanted Sansa watched, possibly spied upon. She kept her expression innocent. "I would be glad to guide her as a friend. She has lost so much. I do worry about her future." "Good," Cersei said. "It's settled then." She rose, dismissing the conversation with a regal tilt of her chin. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." Marjorie bowed her head graciously, rising from her seat. "Of course, Your Grace." She left the solar, her footsteps echoing along the corridor. Her mind whirled with speculation about Cersei's motives. Was this an attempt to keep Sansa docile, or to glean secrets from the girl that could be used against the Starks? Possibly both. And if Sansa were truly a key to the north, House Tyrell might also have an interest in her. In her own chambers later that evening, Marjorie confided in her trusted lady-in-waiting, Eleanor Fossaway. "The Queen Regent wants me to watch Sansa. She pretends it's for the girl's benefit, but we both know it's to prevent any alliance Sansa might forge in secret. The Starks are still rebellious in the north, as far as the crown is concerned." Eleanor nodded. "Will you comply?" Marjorie sighed. "Yes, in a manner of speaking, but I won't do Sansa harm. She's suffered too much already." Eleanor glanced around to ensure no one else was listening. If Sansa truly remains a valuable pawn, could House Tyrell secure her friendship for our own ends? Marjorie considered that. Perhaps, if something catastrophic happened, if Robb Stark were killed and Sansa became the next in line, our family might push for her betrothal to one of our cousins. It would link the Tyrell name to Winterfell, but that is a far-off scenario, and a grim one. I will not root for the Starks' demise. Eleanor's expression was thoughtful. Still, it is good to keep options open. Marjorie nodded, feeling the weight of every possibility. In King's Landing, one learned to juggle alliances like torches. A single misstep could burn everything down. Across Blackwater Bay, in the dank cells beneath the Red Keep, the Red Priestess Melisandre remained a prisoner. Since Stannis Baratheon's execution, she had refused to eat, except for sips of water. Guards reported that she spent hours muttering prayers to her foreign god, Lawler. Each day, the jailers came with crusts of bread and watery stew, which she barely touched. One night, a hush fell over the dungeons when a cloaked figure arrived, accompanied by a single lantern. The guards outside Melisandre's cell made to block the visitor, but a gold dragon coin changed hands, and they averted their eyes. The figure stepped close to the iron bars, lifting the lantern to illuminate Melisandre's gaunt features. Her red hair hung lank around her face, and her ruby necklace glimmered faintly in the dimness. "You," said Melisandre, her voice a rasp. "Come to gloat, have you?" "No, my lady," replied the visitor in a low voice. "I come with an offer." She laughed, a hollow sound. "An offer? From the Lannisters? They have caged me like a beast, stolen my king's life. I have nothing to give them." "This offer does not come from the Lannisters," the hooded figure said. "There are those who see advantage in your knowledge of certain arts. Perhaps we can help each other." Melisandre eyed the shape in the shadows. "Who are you, then?" A pause. "I am no one important. A friend to those who need one occasionally. You remain powerful even here. If you are freed, you might be of use." The priestess leaned closer to the bars. "And what would you have me do? My powers are not a toy. I serve the Lord of Light, and I must do his bidding." "Precisely," murmured the visitor. "But the great other does not lie only in the north. Darkness dwells in many corners of this realm. If one day you escape, you might share certain insights that alone might interest those who fear what lurks beyond. The Lannisters keep you caged because they believe your powers are real, and they cannot risk you sowing chaos." Melisandre's eyes burned with a strange light. "Chaos is a ladder," she said softly, "and shadows are born of light." The visitor produced a small vial, pressing it through the bars. "A little gift. It might ease your bodily pains, or help you see visions more clearly. Use it if you wish. I will return when the time is right." She took the vial, her thin hand closing around it. "Why do you do this?" A low, mysterious chuckle. "Because the realm is always in need of fire to burn away the darkness, whether the realm knows it or not. We shall see if your God truly grants you the powers people fear." With that, the visitor withdrew, leaving Melisandre alone with her flickering lamp and her unwavering faith. In the next weeks, King's Landing bustled as never before. The Tyrell supply lines brought fresh produce, casks of wine, and well-fed livestock. Merchants from across the narrow sea set up stalls in the city, hawking exotic wares. The small folk found themselves somewhat relieved from hunger, though the city remained crowded and disease lurked in the warrens of Flea Bottom. Joffrey proclaimed a festival to celebrate the birth anniversary of his father, King Robert, a father whose memory he invoked only when it suited him. Marjorie arranged a series of charitable events, distributing bread and sweets in Robert's name. The irony did not escape Tyrion, who commented wryly to Varys that Robert would have preferred casks of ale to pious gestures. Nonetheless, the festival proceeded, and the mood in the city was more cheerful than it had been in years. During the celebrations, the royal family made a procession through the city. Joffrey rode in a gilded litter, flanked by guards with lion-crested shields. Marjorie sat at his side, wearing a gown of gold silk embroidered with roses. The crowd cheered, showering the litter with petals. At one point, a child ran forward to present the queen with a wreath of flowers. Marjorie graciously accepted, placing it on her head. Joffrey sneered but said nothing, for the cheers resounded like thunder. In the midst of this spectacle, Cersei rode behind them, noticing how the crowd's cheers seemed directed more at Marjorie than at Joffrey. It enraged her that the small folk so easily transferred their adoration from one figure to another. She yearned to lash out, but Tywin's voice echoed in her mind. Let them adore the Tyrell queen, so long as they obey the king. That evening, a grand feast was held in the throne room. Tables groaned under the weight of spiced boar, lamprey pie, honey cakes, lemon tarts, and exotic fruit from Dorne. Minstrels played rousing tunes of King Robert's victories, though some were ironically overshadowed by the presence of the Tyrell lion banners. Cersei sat to Joffrey's left, Margaery to his right, and in that arrangement, the entire court saw how the two queens bracketed the boy king. One overshadowed by time, the other rising in influence. Partway through the feast, Sansa Stark was summoned to approach the dais. She did so, trembling slightly, but wearing a forced smile. Margaery beckoned her closer, then turned to Joffrey. "Your Grace, Lady Sansa has helped me arrange a distribution of food to the city orphans. This very morning, she visited the Street of Flower with me. Would you permit me to commend her publicly for her kindness?" Joffrey shrugged, bored. "If you must." Margaery smiled at Sansa. "Lady Sansa, your generosity is appreciated by the entire realm." The queen then lifted a small golden brooch, shaped like a rose in bloom, and pinned it to Sansa's dress. A hush went through the hall as watchers recognized a subtle sign of Tyrell favor. Sansa's voice quavered with gratitude. "Your Grace is too kind. I only did what I could." Margaery squeezed her hand. "You did more than you know." Joffrey looked on, uninterested until he heard scattered applause from the lords in the hall. His brow furrowed, as though uncertain whether to be annoyed or claim credit. He settled for turning back to his wine. From the other side of the dais, Cersei watched with narrowed eyes. She saw how Margaery bestowed a Tyrell emblem on the Stark girl. She recalled her father's warning to keep watch for Tyrell manipulations. If the Tyrells bound Sansa closer to them, House Stark's claim might, in time, benefit the Tyrells. She made a mental note to speak with her father again. When Sansa stepped away, her face was flushed with both relief and confusion. She had never been singled out for such an honor since coming to King's Landing. As she returned to her seat, she tried to make sense of Margaery's gesture. Was it genuine kindness or some deeper ploy? Either way, Sansa was too isolated, too fearful to reject the olive branch. The feast continued long into the night, culminating in dancing and masked performers dressed as stags, lions, and roses. Wine flowed freely, so by the time the king declared the festivities over, many courtiers were well in their cups. Outside, the moon bathed the city in a silver glow. In the weeks that followed, Tywin Lannister accelerated his dealings with the Freys. Reports came that House Frey had effectively seized more lands near the Trident, solidifying their hold as reward for betraying the Tullus. Lord Walder Frey clamored for official recognition from the crown, seeking to become Warden of the Trident, a newly minted title that would place him above the scattered remnants of House Tully. Tywin considered the request. Elevating Walder Frey might cause resentment among older, more distinguished riverlords, but the Freys were his best tool to keep the Riverlands docile. Meanwhile, the Ironborn continued their raids in the north, and rumors suggested that Balon Greyjoy had fallen ill, leaving his children to jockey for power. Yara Greyjoy, called Asha by some, led the most daring raids, while Theon Greyjoy was rumored to be captured or possibly dead. The details were scarce. Tyrion attended each small council meeting, scribbling notes as Pycelle droned about food stores. Mace Tyrell boasted of his knight's prowess, and Littlefinger made subtle remarks about the crown's finances. Varys smiled his usual cryptic smile, contributing little but always listening. Tywin directed the council with an iron composure, deciding which updates mattered and which could be dismissed. One morning, after a particularly long session discussing how to handle the Iron Bank of Braavos' demands, Tywin lingered in the council chamber with Tyrion, Mace Tyrell, and Pycelle. Mace had grown increasingly comfortable in King's Landing, relishing the recognition he had gained from the Dragonstone victory. "I say we should hold a grand tournament to celebrate the realm's stabilization," Mace declared with a grin. "A demonstration of how House Tyrell and House Lannister stand side by side." Tywin regarded him impassively. "A tournament is expensive, my lord, and we have debts to pay. The Iron Bank does not accept valiant justs as currency." Mace waved a hand. "Surely the crown can spare some expense for a display of unity. It would lift the small folk's spirits as well." Tyrion coughed. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, my lord, but we are quite in debt. If you wish to fund such a tournament from your own coffers, that might be possible." Mace's face reddened. Highgarden's gold is for the good of the realm, yes, but we must not empty our vaults entirely. Tywin cut in, his tone final. We will consider a more modest event, perhaps a single day's joust for the city's entertainment, but nothing extravagant. Mace tried to argue, but Tywin's flinty gaze silenced him. Very well, the Tyrell lord relented. A modest event. He cleared his throat and shifted the subject. What of the north, my lord? Are we to march? We Tyrells can lend a detachment if necessary, so long as our presence does not appear overreaching. That was Mace's roundabout way of saying he wouldn't mind claiming some spoils if the crown invaded the north. Tyrion noticed the glint in Tywin's eyes. We are not marching yet, Tywin said. The wolf fights the kraken. Let them weaken each other. When the time is ripe, we shall act. Mace nodded, though his disappointment showed. As you say, my lord. One day, perhaps, young King Robb will see sense and bend the knee. Or the Ironborn will devour him. That is enough for now, Tywin said, dismissing him with a curt nod. When Mace left, only Tyrion, Tywin, and Pycelle remained. Pycelle gathered his parchments and tottered off, leaving father and son alone. Tywin eyed Tyrion. You see, the Tyrells already seek greater glory. We will not grant them too much, or they will overshadow us. Tyrion nodded. Yes, father, but we also need them content enough not to challenge us. A delicate balance indeed. Tywin rose, stepping toward the window. We have time, and in time we will regain full control of the realm. Balon Greyjoy is an old fool. Once he dies, his Ironborn will fracture. The North will remain battered by that conflict. We only need wait for the proper moment to press our advantage. And if by some chance the Tyrells grow tired of waiting and make alliances of their own, Tyrion ventured. Tywin's gaze was cold. They will regret it. They know what happened to Houses Rain and Tarbeck. They will not risk open defiance unless they believe they can best us. And that will never happen. Tyrion frowned but held his tongue, uncertain whether even Tywin could see every possibility. Late one evening, as Margaery dressed for bed, she found a sealed letter slipped beneath her chamber door. The seal bore the golden rose of Highgarden. She broke it open and recognized her grandmother's handwriting at once. My sweetling, I write from Old Town where I have met certain parties. All is well, but I remind you never to lower your guard. The Lannisters remain proud and sharp. Should circumstances become difficult, you must have the means to protect yourself and find allies. Keep Sansa Stark close, for she may prove useful either as a friend or as leverage. And keep your dear husband sweet, for men of his nature can lash out if they sense rejection. Above all, trust in your wits. The rose, after all, has its thorns. With love, grandmother. Margaery folded the letter and placed it carefully in a hidden compartment of her jewelry box. The words steeled her resolve. Olenna might be physically far away, but her counsel remained ever watchful. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Margaery glanced at a mirror of polished bronze, regarding her own reflection. The crown on her head glinted in the candlelight. In the reflection, she saw not only a young woman but a queen who held the hearts of the small folk, yet was married to a king whose nature was cruel and unpredictable, and entangled in an alliance that could shift like sand under her feet. Summoning courage, she reminded herself that every step she took must be deliberate. One misstep could undo all the Tyrells had gained. She thought of Loras, of how he had lost Renly, how he served in the Kingsguard with stoic resignation. She thought of her mother and father, siblings and cousins, all counting on her to keep the family's fortunes rising. She thought of the countless small folk who had pinned their hopes on her goodness. In the corridor outside, she heard Joffrey's voice, raised in anger. He was berating a servant for some minor slight. Then another voice, presumably a guard, tried to calm him. A slap, a yelp, silence followed. Margaery felt her stomach tighten. Such was life in the Red Keep. Violence simmered beneath every surface. She must remain vigilant. Tomorrow would bring fresh concerns, whispers of the north, updates on the Ironborn raids, pleas from the city's poor. She closed her eyes, reciting a silent prayer to the seven to grant her wisdom. Then she rose, set the crown upon its stand, and slipped into bed. That night, she dreamed of a field of golden roses under a brilliant sun, but the sky darkened, overshadowed by a shape she could not quite see. Perhaps a lion, or a flock of ravens, or a black dragon from old tales. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, uncertain whether the dream had been a promise or a warning. As winter crept closer, so too did the realm's sense of foreboding. The watchers on the wall sent sporadic ravens south, speaking of wildlings gathering, of strange sightings beyond the haunted forest. The news drew little attention in King's Landing. What did wildlings matter when the north was a battlefield and the south was flush with coin? But in the smoky corners of taverns, old men muttered about the long night, half-remembered tales of the others that lurked in icy wastes. In Bravos, the Iron Bank quietly tallied the crown's debts. There were rumors that the bank might extend a line of credit to certain rebel factions if the crown did not repay soon. In the hills of the Vale, Lisa Arryn kept her gates barred, refusing to join any side in the war, content to watch from her mountain stronghold. And far across the sea, in Essos, Daenerys Targaryen guided her 3 young dragons through their first flights. Few in Westeros believed the rumors. Dragons had been extinct for centuries, so how could a Targaryen girl hatch them? Nevertheless, the whispers persisted, carried by sailors and merchants who had glimpsed miracles in the east. Eventually, all these currents would collide. But for now, the Lion and the Rose held firm in the capital. The Tyrell alliance with the Lannisters had crushed the Baratheons early, securing an uneasy peace throughout the south. The banners of Highgarden and Casterly Rock snapped side by side in the Red Keep's courtyard, proclaiming unity. Within that unity, 1,000 fractures lurked. Cersei's jealousy, Olenna's maneuvers, Tyrion's cynicism, Marjorie's careful diplomacy. Each thread was woven into a tapestry stretched taut by ambition. Any sudden pull might unravel it all. For the time being, the realm breathed easier. King Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, glowering like a petulant child behind golden steel. Marjorie Tyrell, beloved by the people, sat at his side. Yet the outer world remained unsettled. The war had not ended so much as pivoted. Balon Greyjoy wore a crown, Robb Stark wore another, and neither recognized Joffrey's rule. The Freys slithered into power in the Riverlands, forging a vicious new status quo. Dorne watched and waited, remembering old wounds. Autumn's days grew short, and a faint chill wind began to blow even this far south. The small folk carried on, lulled by the year's good harvest, praising the new queen as a figure of generosity. In the Red Keep's garden, Marjorie's roses continued to bloom, carefully tended. But in the darkest corners, shadows gathered, and the acrid smell of wildfire, long stockpiled by the late Targaryen kings, still lingered in the city's hidden vaults. All it might take was a single spark to remind everyone how fragile peace could be. Thus, the aftermath of Olenna Tyrell's fateful choice to ally with Tywin Lannister unfolded in an intricate dance of politics, personal grudges, and looming threats. The Baratheons had been crushed early, sparing the capital a ruinous siege. Yet the victory's cost was measured in the quiet tensions that rumbled beneath the surface. If and when the next crisis emerged, the Rose and the Lion might find themselves at odds once more, each determined to claim the realm's future, no matter how much blood might be spilled. For now, a hush of relative calm stretched over King's Landing. The city feasted, the royals paraded, the gold cloaks patrolled, and somewhere in the flickering candlelight of night, a queen with a gentle smile and cunning eyes laid her head on a pillow, while a king with cruelty in his veins tossed restlessly in his bed. The hush was an illusion, a lull in the storm, and though no one could see it yet, the storm clouds were gathering on all horizons. There are victories that taste of ashes, and alliances that plant the seeds of new wars. In time, all the illusions would fall away, revealing the unstoppable churn of history. But until then, the Red Keep's bells tolled the hour, the black waters of the bay lapped against the quays, and the last echoes of the War of the Five Kings seemed far away, as though the realm might finally know peace. Such was the dream, and such was the fragility of it all.